My Ladino is too limited to introduce properly the next book, Calypso Jew. Let me tell you that when we first met and saw the book, everyone jumped on it, saying, "What is it?" And what it was a beautiful discovery. Discovery of the Jewish presence in the Caribbean. And what Dr. Casteel did was not only to reveal a 500 years journey within the Caribbean for Jews first, well, expelled from Spain, and the way they integrate and played with the society around them. So there was this beautiful revelation of on a historical level of Jewish world that most of us, I'm ready to say 99.9% of us, didn't have the slightest clue about. But that would have done a nice scholarly book on historical basis. But this book is quite more than that. It is also the perception of the world through literature. And so it's really appropriate that the literary award stopped on it or rewarded it in the way that what the books offers is a reading of the world through a series of pieces of literature. And for instance, showed us how the Holocaust, which we would feel was so far from the Caribbean experience, indeed marked to a large extent the production over there. So, as she just told me, probably we all have some roots in the Caribbean Jewry. So my wife and I are now planning to go to the Caribbean to explore our roots. Dr. Casteel, please.
Thank you so much, Alain, for that wonderful introduction. I'm so honored to be in the company of these wonderful writers and scholars and to be a recipient of a Canadian Jewish Literary Award. I'm enormously grateful to the members of the jury for this recognition. My book examines how contemporary Caribbean writers invoke Jewish historical experience in order to better understand slavery and its legacies. The creative writers that I discuss recall a little-known chapter of Jewish history in which Jewish refugees from the Iberian expulsions in the late 15th century and later from the Nazis in the 1930s found refuge in the Caribbean. In the late 1930s, hundreds of European Jews found safe haven in various parts of the Caribbean, including Trinidad, where the community called itself the Calypso Jews. So it's from that episode of, a little-known episode of Holocaust history that I drew the title of my book. And I thought I'd read you just a couple of verses from a calypso that was written in 1938, so at the moment where these Jewish refugees were arriving in the Caribbean. This is a calypso called Jews in the West Indies by the Calypsonian guerrilla. Sorry that I can't sing it. It would have been sung originally. Tell me what you think of a dictator trampling the Jews like Adolf Hitler, tumbling them out of Germany, some running for refuge in the West Indies. Some land in Demerara and Grenada. They land in Trinidad, very regular. The way they are coming, all of them, will make Trinidad a new Jerusalem. Discussions of Blacks and Jews usually tell the story of an alliance between African Americans and Jewish Americans that subsequently collapses. So the story with which I think we're most familiar is one that begins in the early 20th century United States with the forging of this alliance, culminating in the Civil Rights Movement, but also beginning to unravel in that period, with Black-Jewish relations finally disintegrating in the early 1990s with the Crown Heights riots and the Nation of Islam's publication of the anti-Semitic tract, The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews. What I've tried to do in my book is to tell a very different story about Black-Jewish relations, one that moves both beyond the national borders of the United States and also beyond the temporal borders of the 20th century. In the book, I set out to try to understand why it is that Jewish characters and themes appear with such regularity in Caribbean literature. I tried to answer questions such as, why does the Guadeloupean writer Maurice Condé include a Jewish merchant in her novel about slavery and the Salem witch trials? Why does the St. Lucian poet and Nobel laureate Derek Walcott identify so strongly with the 19th century Sephardic Jewish painter Camille Pissarro that he wrote a book-length poem about him? Why does the young protagonist of Jamaican writer Michelle Cliff's classic novel Abeng secretly check out books about the Holocaust from her local library in Kingston, Jamaica, and hide them under her mattress? Why does the Black British writer Carol Phillips write with a poster of Anne Frank hanging above his desk? Part of the challenge for me in answering these questions in the book is that Jewish studies and post-colonial studies are two fields that really haven't talked to each other. But while academics have a tendency to divide and compartmentalize Jewish and post-colonial experience, creative writing reveals how the Jewish and African diasporas become intertwined in the colonial Caribbean. And it's for this reason that I also want to thank the writers whose work was so inspiring to me while I was carrying out the research for this book. Because creative writers aren't constrained by the kinds of boundaries that we tend to set up in academic disciplines, they have been able to explore connections between the Jewish and African diasporas that academics for a long time overlooked. And it's for this reason, although there's now a very rich and interesting body of historical scholarship that's emerging about the Jewish Caribbean and the Jewish Atlantic, as it's being called, although I really value that historical scholarship, I also think it's really important that we pay attention to the creative writing that addresses this history. I'd also really like to thank members of the contemporary Caribbean Jewish communities, such as Ainsley Henriquez in Jamaica, who offered me a great deal of encouragement and assistance as I was working on the book. The Canadian Jewish Literary Award will, I hope, help to draw further attention to this neglected history of Black-Jewish relations in the Caribbean and to the literature that it has inspired. This award is especially meaningful to me because my book addresses such an untraditional subject, a subject that lies at the margins of both Jewish and Caribbean studies. And when I was looking for a publisher for the book, I had some difficulty because the subject that I was addressing didn't really fit any of these established categories. So I would particularly like to thank the members of the jury of the Canadian Jewish Literary Awards for this recognition and for affirming that a book about Caribbean literature can have a place within Jewish studies. So thank you for that. Thanks, everyone.